crying and later told Jürgen that he was expected to be home by 7:30. He wanted to take the young boy to the cave, but instead he walked him out into a field and he said, "Be quiet, turn around now." He took a heavy hammer and he hit him hard on the head from behind. Ulrich screamed loud and Jürgen hit him again and again until he lost consciousness. Jürgen didn't know his name, but he read about it later in a newspaper. Jürgen assumed that Ulrich had died. He put him into the car and drove in the direction of Langenberg to his cave. That day, though, there were a lot of people walking past the opening to his air raid shelter, so he had to continue driving past and in the direction of the Langenberg transmission tower. He had to go up a winding road past a few farms. The floor of Jürgen's car was covered in blood. Without warning, the transmission of the van started to roar. There was something wrong. Jürgen had no choice. He had to turn around and head back. This disturbed him. He wasn't sure what he was going to do or where he would go in order to stay out of sight. He finally arrived at a parking lot. To his surprise, Ulrich stirred. He was still alive. Jürgen said, "I hit it again, but out of horror more than anything. He still stirred, so I hit him again, and then he died." Jürgen drove past the cave a second and a third time, and finally, people had dispersed enough that he was able to take Ulrich inside the cave. He mutilated his corpse, cutting open his stomach and emptying his body cavity. Though he remained fully clothed, he laid himself down and masturbated next to Ulrich's corpse. And then he left. Unknown to Jürgen, there was a small break in the case of missing Ulrich. A self-timer was being used on the bumper cars that showed Ulrich and a young man together. The photo was sharp and clear. The newspaper Die Neue Illustriert published an appeal for information from the public. The page read, "Do you know this man? This is a kidnapper. We want your help to catch him. In consultation with police and the public prosecutor, we are offering a reward of 20,000 Deutschmark to the person who hands over the kidnapper to the police. 20,000 marks for the head of the man who kidnapped 3 children. Take note, the creep is 17 to 23 years old, around 1.75 to 1.8 meters tall." Their efforts were unsuccessful. No one knew who the man was in the photo, but now there was a name for this monster: the Fairground Killer. There was some protest from the people running the fairs. They believed that this advertisement was discrediting showmen and their parish fairs. Jürgen later wrote that he was struck by the fact that Ulrich had been wearing beautiful, clean, white underwear. He had just put them on that morning or even in the afternoon. He remembered that when he lived at home, he would change his underwear every day. His mother would ensure it. When he came home from living at Marienhausen, he would only change his underwear every second or third day. He said tearing Ulrich's underwear down was a very, very special pleasure for him. When he returned to his cave at another time, Jürgen was disgusted by the state of decay that Ulrich's body was in. The maggots were inside the abdominal cavity only. The back, buttocks, and legs were all completely unchanged so far, so he turned the corpse over and suddenly became aroused again. He said in his interrogation, this child had a particularly beautiful body. He left Ulrich's body lying in a pit. He changed the position using a shovel and was pleased with the way it looked. He made sure not to look at the decaying, rotting side of the body, and so he was able to imagine him whole still. Jürgen slapped the corpse with the shovel several times, including at the top of his neck. He remarked that this was immensely pleasurable for him. He was disgusted with seeing a decaying corpse, but whenever he didn't look at the rotting flesh, he was comfortable. When asked by his lawyer about the smell, Jürgen said that he was completely unaffected by it because it was from a child. He believed that had he smelled this from a grown-up, he would be far less comfortable. Jürgen wrote in his letters that he couldn't remember the act of masturbating over any of his victims. However, he said if he had done so, it was always after they were dead and either partially or fully dismembered. Comforting. One night, Jürgen and Detlef had been drinking schnapps and wine and Williamsburn pear brandy. Jürgen finished around 2/3 of the bottle on his own. Detlef invited some friends to join them, and this angered Jürgen, so he left. He drove to a bar and he drank 2 more glasses of wine. He got back in his car and was driving erratically, snaking back and forth on the road at around 80 miles per hour toward an overpass. The police saw him and stopped him and took his license immediately. This created new challenges for Jürgen. Without a car, he was unable to just move around freely finding boys and taking them to his cave. He soon overcame these challenges, resorting to riding the bus with his victims or using a taxi. He believed that he would continue to do this for years to come, so in losing his license he felt that this was just a small break in his ongoing spree of kidnapping and murdering. Jürgen also started to take time to polish his story to lure boys to the cave. He spent weeks lurking around Porscheplatz in Essen and at the Fairground, developing the method that he would use to entice young boys to accompany him. He said, "I'll tell them I'm a detective and I found something fascinating hidden or buried there." He would definitely come along voluntarily. Many boys ran away and others wanted nothing to do with it, but eventually his story worked. He later said, "I felt silly talking to little boys, but I knew what I was going to do. I just tried, and one day, it worked." In his letters, Jürgen wrote, "The feeling isn't as if it's some kind of absolute, immediate compulsion. This is completely wrong. But it is also wrong to say that there's no compulsion at all. It's still a compulsion. It just varies in strength. It's something I deal with every day and I feel bothered by it. It's an urge. It's not like saying, well, now you have nothing to do, just go around the next corner and kill someone. It's not that easy. It's just a feeling that drives you, and in the long run, you cannot let go of that feeling." Jürgen was drinking heavily in the weeks after losing his license, in a big way. He described the period as having a moral hangover. He would hide liquor in his car and in the bookcase so that there was always something for him to drink. He said that he was always tipsy and his mind was always foggy. The reality was that he wasn't able to drive anymore, and that soon hit home. But he had a moment of clarity. He had a boost, and out of sheer desperation, he came up with a plan. He decided that he was going to buy a large trunk or suitcase, buy some ether, and then take a cab in order to find boys. He decided he would take boys to a quiet alley, drug them, put them in the suitcase, put the suitcase in the taxi, and then unload them from the taxi at the air raid shelter, hoping and praying, of course, that the boy would still be drugged and unconscious when they arrived, so as not to arouse suspicion from the cab drivers. Ether was not easy to come by, but he had a pharmacy where he used to source chemicals for his magic tricks from time to time, so at first they didn't think much of it when he went and asked to buy it. After the third or fourth time of buying ether, however, the pharmacist said, "Who are you trying to stun with this?" Jürgen needed to be careful. His plan was optimistic. He would stand in a corner and wet the handkerchief with the ether, but by the time he was chasing the boy, the ether would evaporate and would be ineffective. Jürgen left his parents' shop at 4 p.m. on a Saturday. His parents assumed that he was going home. They didn't know that he was traveling around by taxi. They thought he was taking a tram or a bus, but Jürgen was stealing cash from the register at the shop to pay for the taxis. To travel to his cave by bus would have taken more than 2 to 3 hours. In a taxi, he was able to get himself to the cave within 35 minutes, and it would cost him 20 Deutschmark. In his cave, he was hiding the giant suitcase. It was made from cardboard. It would have most likely fit an adult human inside. It was something that definitely caught everyone's attention, so Jürgen would make sure that no one was coming along the street, take the case out, order another taxi at the payphone. He would then travel to Hattingen, around 10 minutes from the cave. This would ensure that he would be there by 5:10 p.m. Once at Hattingen, he would go out looking for boys. He would search until around 6 or 6:30, but found that by then it was getting too late. All the boys that he was interested in had already gone home. In the pocket of his jacket, he had the ether bottle and cotton balls, and in the other side, he had shackles and candles. In the cave, he kept his knife. He rarely came across any children that he wanted. Whenever he would see one, he would follow them. When he felt that it was particularly dark or they were alone enough, he would put the suitcase in a corner, making sure to stay relatively close to where he'd left it. After putting the suitcase down, he would run after the child. If they would get more than 100 meters away, he would give up the chase. And this occurred 20 to 30 times unsuccessfully. Jürgen recalled a time that he'd followed a boy who had been lost. Before he was able to make a move, though, an older woman came up to the boy and asked, "What's the matter? Where are you going?" Jürgen lost his nerve. Jürgen had started to keep a diary during this time. Not a diary in the traditional sense, writing thoughts and feelings. Instead, this was a specialized plan of how and when he wanted to commit his crimes. In the beginning of the diary, he had put 3 crosses to signify the 3 murders that he'd already committed. Then he wrote things for each day. For example, leave the shop at a certain time, take a taxi at such and such an hour, pick up the suitcase at such, and then arrive in Hattingen by a particular hour. Bring the boy into the cave by such and such, clean up and be home at such and such a time. Everything was written in mirror writing. This is a form of cipher similar to that of Leonardo da Vinci's notes for the famous Vitruvian Man. Every 3 weeks on a Sunday from around 3 p.m. until 7:30 p.m, Jürgen's parents insisted that he go with them to visit his grandmother. Jürgen was free on Mondays from around 5 p.m. until 7:30. Tuesday, he was unable to leave the shop or the house at all. On Wednesday, he would leave the shop between 3 and 4 and was expected to report to his mother after his 2.5-hour bus ride, but after that he was officially allowed to go out into the village. On Fridays, Jürgen attended vocational college until around 1:30 p.m. He didn't really have money for a taxi at the time, so he was forced to take the bus home. This allowed him only around 15 to 30 minutes to look for a boy. He had all afternoon on Saturday, and sometimes he would be late home and started making excuses for his whereabouts. He was still also drinking heavily, and this caused many an argument with his mother at home. One particular evening, he had had a beer. His mother tried to spank him. Jürgen grabbed her arms to stop her, and in true dramatic fashion, Mrs. Bartsch ran to her bedroom, threw herself onto the bed, crying and screaming that she'd sacrificed her life for him and how dare he, etc. Throughout it all, Jürgen never hit his mother, no matter how pissed off he was. During the year before his arrest, Jürgen told his parents that he was a member of the Magic Circle Club for amateur magicians. They met every first Wednesday of the month. This allowed him from 6 p.m. until midnight. He never attended the last few meetings. He said later that he felt it was his duty to search for boys, even though most of them would have been home by the late hours that he was out. He was just trying anything. Eventually, Jürgen decided to drop the suitcase method that he was using. He found that it was becoming too laborious. He was limited exclusively to using a taxi and used them like they were his own vehicle. He would travel to Essen, to Bochum, and sometimes to Navigus and Velbert. Using taxis to travel to his hidden sanctuary was becoming dangerous, but he felt as though he had no other choice. In total, he approached around 100 boys, in many cases from behind. Most of them were able to fight him off or run away. In 1968, Jürgen wrote a letter to his lawyer about Christmas and because of his miserable upbringing that his family never celebrated. To distract himself from knowing what other families were probably doing on Christmas Day, he would lose himself in thought. In his letter, he explains, "I thought of the house in Gelsenkirchen where Peter Fuchs grew up. It was the house in which no door was ever locked until June 21st, the day I was arrested. That was the poor boy I picked up on my way back from vacation. Without beating around the bush, I saw immediately that the little one had lost his way in Essen and didn't know where to turn. I took advantage of that immediately. The boy hadn't eaten since morning, and I can still see his face beaming with happiness when I offered to help him. That should have touched me, for heaven's sake. That's what I say to myself today, and that's what I said to myself then. But at that stage, nothing could hold me anymore. Nothing could pity me anymore. You could then, and I'm serious, only compare me to a predator that already had his victims in its claws. Such a predator dies before releasing its prey. I too would have died in time rather than take a single step back